All right. Thanks, Ash. Thanks, sponsors. Thanks, Phil, for joining us. It's it's a it's just Phil and I at the moment.
What
Mike
about
isn't going to
me?
be on. Ashley too. I knew they knew you were on. I was really meaning that Barbara's not on and Mike's not on tonight. Barbara maybe is going to be
Mike's going
jumping
to see
on
his
a
mom
little bit later.
tonight.
Yeah, that's what Ash said. Well, welcome everybody. Glad to be here again. Phil, what number are we? I know you know this one.
Plus one.
Plus one. Everybody
51.
feels showing the IJSPT commemorative mug. Yeah, I got mine too.
All
Dr.
right.
Freehill, you did. I feel horrible. We
We
don't
got to
have
get
one for
Dr.
you.
Freehill
Yeah, we
one.
have to give Dr.
I got the
Freehill one.
AOSSM one here,
Oh,
There
so
there
you
you
go.
go.
That
Okay,
there's
counts.
an
That counts.
association,
That's
right?
good.
that's good. Well, so thanks everyone. I got to be honest with you. We're really honored tonight to have Dr. Michael Freehill with us. Mike was with us 2 weeks ago at AOSSM. Some of us were and some of you, I'm sure, listening were at AOSSM. Hopefully, some of you were at the AASPT conference where he did a fantastic shoulder talk. So he was really busy during that entire meeting. He is a associate professor of orthopedic surgery, shoulder elbow specialist for Stanford Sports Medicine. And before, well, I'm introducing you obviously, but Dr. Freehill, I talked to him about this at the meeting a couple of weeks ago. This is really awesome to have him on talking about baseball injuries because I don't know if you guys know this or not, but he played professional baseball himself. So maybe that would be a good way to start by telling us a little bit more about yourself, Dr. Freehill. Do you mind telling everybody just kind of briefly about your stint in ball?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me, by the way. It's
You're welcome.
pretty awesome. So a great honor. Yeah, so I grew up in Arizona and ended up the Cliff Notes. Ended up at University of San Diego as an infielder, and I was pre-med and trying to get into med school. I was like, yeah, this is pretty. These classes are pretty tough. Or doing well in these classes is tough, and I didn't hit as well as they thought I would probably hit. I don't know, it was sleep deprivation or something, but I had a good arm, so they converted me to pitcher, and I just had some natural ability that some pro teams were interested in, and if you get the opportunity, you're going to go. So I got drafted by the Angels, and didn't have much pressure at first because I just thought to myself, I'll do this for a year to say I did it, or a year or two, and then, but I'll go back to med school. But I had some success, so it just kept building. So I ended up doing that for about 7.5 years. Got pretty high. I was on the 40-man roster for 2 years. Got hurt on the 40-man roster with the Angels and had thermal capsulorrhaphy, which is a good, in like in the ortho world and the PT world and the ATC world, it's like, whoa, it's remember when? Yeah, I
Uh-huh,
was one of
exactly.
those, a survivor. But it
Survivor.
was cool because Dr. Yoakum out at Curl and Joke did it, and he became a great mentor. And it was, I mean, at the time that was what was going on in the late
Yeah, that was
'90s,
the procedure. Yeah. Yeah.
and and we exhausted conservative management. I had a great physical therapist. I mean, my physical therapist in Arizona was Keith Coker, whom and a lot of you
Yeah.
might
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And, so I had the best, the best of the best. The ATC team for the Angels at the time, Rick Schmidt and others, and
Yeah.
Keith Coker was the other guy, and then Yoakum as the doctor. I mean, it's like, man, I was set up in a pretty good position. So we exhausted conservative management and had that done. Didn't come back. It's different. I think when you alter the shoulder, it's a lot different than elbow procedures in my mind. It's almost you have a lifetime of proprioception built up of throwing, and then you disrupt that.
Yeah.
So it was different, but I ended up getting released, got picked up by Texas because I'd gotten pretty high, and played 2 more years and got back up to AAA, but it was never quite the same. But it was a blessing in disguise, as hard as it was at the time to be on the doorstep of you, if you will, of the big leagues, and because going through the experience and going through the a surgery or a lot of PT before failing, going through the surgery, going through all this PT again, having these ups, these downs, the throwing program. It's a lot easier to like relate to throwers, because as you guys know even better than me, very rarely is there this straight line of, issue and getting back to where you want to
Resolution.
be.
Yeah, resolution.
There's
Yeah.
these small undulations of setbacks and things that you don't anticipate, and you guys are in conversations with us all the time. So and so, a little setback for this reason or that reason. So we're always, so I think it's easier to work with athletes, especially baseball players, having gone through that.
Oh
Then I
yeah.
went
Yeah.
back, then I went to Tulane for
Mm.
med school, which we were talking about, and Johns Hopkins for residency. And I wanted to take care of teams, and I wanted to do everything in the shoulder and throwers' elbows. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. So I felt I needed to do two fellowships. So I came out to Stanford for sports because it was nice blend between, all the college sports, but you also got some high school and you got some pro. So it was really good with Mark Safran to learn how to, take care of athletes, if you will,
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
work with ATCs and work with PTs and work with families, because that's a big part of it. Just doing the surgeries is one slice. And then I went back to Harvard shoulder service, and that's where I did, like, all my shoulder stuff and some of the elbow stuff. So
Yeah. Well,
and
that
then
that history, yeah,
yeah,
that history that you have, and going through all of that yourself, I agree with you. Gives you a total different perspective, I think, than probably 99% of healthcare professionals and surgeons. And the fact that you've taken that now and kind of specialized in shoulder and elbow, where you had your injury, and pitchers is, I think, is very favorable for all of your patients. I would think they would really be glad that you had all that happen and were able to go through all that. So you know exactly what they're going through, which is great. So, Barbara, welcome.
Hello, sorry to be tardy. I just arrived at my grandkids' house and they were busy, busy, and I was like lost track of time, so sorry, here I am.
Okay, we're glad to have you on.
Welcome, Dr. Freehill. Thanks for coming, hanging out with us.
thanks. Yeah.
Better late than never, Barb. Okay, you guys ready to hit it? We're going to start our first paper. Our first paper is published in the journal Shoulder and Elbow Surgery International, 2025, so just last year. Dr. Freehill is the primary author on it, or the first author on it. And it is hand size association with ulnar collateral ligament reconstruction in professional baseball players. And just I'll give you a quick the purpose of this study was to investigate if there was a correlation between hand size and history of UCL tear requiring a reconstruction. And the hypothesis was that smaller hand size will be correlated with higher UCL reconstruction rates in professional baseball players. And we'll dive into this and talk about why that is important. So to start with, Dr. Freehill, can you tell us, this is really your study, you and your partner here study. What inspired you to look at hand size as a risk factor for UCL reconstructions in professional baseball players? What made you even come up with that idea to think about it? It seems like it was pretty somewhat novel, I guess, but
Well, I think, going back 5 years, uh, before COVID at least, we're still, the same ideas were coming up, velocity, workload. Not to say that those aren't important, they are, of course, especially with, the amount of year-round throwing and workload with the younger throwers. But, it's the same thoughts and even the same types of research, and we're not seeing improvements, in my opinion, in the injuries that we're seeing with regard to the thrower's elbow, especially in the youth athletes, right? Let's say a lot of literature comes in the pro guys, but the youth, as we all know, is where the biggest incidence of this is, with the 15 to 19-year-olds have the highest. So, my thought was that, kids, um, their hands aren't as big, right? So,
mhm.
if you're a pro guy, you probably have generally speaking, have a bigger hand. If you're a kid with a smaller hand, you're really squeezing that just to hold it, because, we know baseball throw, fastest human motion ever recorded. They have to squeeze it enough just so it doesn't get out of their hand when they're going. And I thought to myself, you know what, is their flexor pronator going to fatigue faster than somebody who, say, doesn't have to work as hard to hold that ball? So it started as the youth idea of that. Maybe they're fatiguing faster and now their physis or their UCL, depending on how old they are musculoskeletally, would see more forces as they start seeing fatigue. And then I was at a meeting and there were two gentlemen who I owe a lot to, because we were talking about this, and one was Steve Lemos, who was the head doc, who when I was at University of Michigan, I helped him with the Tigers, and a great guy, and really talked about this same thoughts. And then Rick Ryu, who some of you probably know from Santa Barbara, who's a very well-known orthopedic surgeon, has been president of ANA, etc. And they thought the same thing. So we started putting this together, and because of the Tigers, we said, hey, it'd be interesting. Let's measure every guy in the organization's hand size. And no one had done that. And you have to have some kind of hypothesis. So that was kind of the working hypothesis. It makes some sense. So we customized this box that you see in the paper and have a glass grid on that. And they would come in as part of the physicals, and we would put their hands either spread wide or closed and had an iPhone under it. So it would take the picture. And then we had some of Dr. Lemos's fellows go through all the, randomized pictures twice, so we get all of our ICC, etc. And then looked back, because another individual on that paper, Corey Trumbull, who's now with the Marlins, who was with the Tigers for a long time, running, the whole minor leagues. We had all that back data of the Tigers and the history and who had, you had to have a fine, like, association endpoint. You couldn't say like elbow pain. You get into a lot of variables. So it was just like they've had UCL surgery. And, so we did that and then looked, and 2 of the 4 measurements were associated. And if you look in the paper, we went like wrist crease to the top of the long finger, and just to do it. Okay. And then we did from the thumb tip to the pinky tip. And then we spread the hand as wide as it would go, and went thumb to pinky, so the width. And then the last one was inertial. You guys know that inertial measurement, right? Because that was described by inertial with tennis players, and how
right?
you would size their racket handle appropriately, as if it's too big or too small, you could have, the lateral epicondylitis, etc. That was all that famous inertial stuff. But the thing that's cool about that, and this is in the hand literature, is that's more of the working length of the hand, because we don't do work back here. Everything's out here.
Baseball.
So the inertial stuff makes a lot of sense. And if you look at the hand literature, it's the same stuff. How you're holding hammers, etc. So that's why we did that 4th one. And interestingly, the ones that did have a demarcation, or a significance cutoff, if you will, was that working length of the hand, inertial, and the spread wide, right? That if it was below this, it was a higher incidence of having a history of UCL, and if it was above it, it didn't. So it was very fascinating, and that now being an associate editor for AJSM, and maybe some of you have heard the story before, but I was like, yeah, this is pretty novel. Like, this isn't the same stuff, like throwing a million things at the wall and seeing what is associated with thing. You can shoot holes all over studies like that. This was like a pretty novel, and the reviews on it were pretty harsh.
Really?
This is reckless medicine. How can you say this?
I can
like,
hear him.
oh.
I can hear him. Yeah.
And I think that, part of it, if you misread it, and I have to explain this, is there in no way was I saying that, hey, if you have a smaller hand, you can't get drafted or you can't make the major leagues. Not at all. I don't think that at all. But what I do think is that if you have a smaller hand, and you're a 5'10" guy, but a very gifted guy, but small hand, and you're throwing 70% sliders, and you're a high leverage guy, reliever, is there a chance that you're working your flexor pronator more? And that could fatigue. And that if it does fatigue, the UCL seeing more stresses. And over the course of a season, does that add up? And do you start getting attenuation of that ligament? Sometimes you have catastrophic failure. That's what I was saying. And if anything, it ties over into the world of athletic training and the world of physical therapy even more, because we need to, I think the missing link, and although it's getting better, it's better in pro ball than other levels, but how do we monitor these things? And Phil and I were talking about some of that before we started, some ways to monitor it. And we don't still have the best way, but it is better. But that's my point. Having an idea, how big are people's hands are, what type of pitcher are they, reliever, starter, what kind of pitch arsenal do they have? And this is the one thing that always is interesting and I don't think it's one thing that causes somebody to be high risk. I think it's a number. I think if you throw 100 miles an hour, you're probably at high risk. But I don't think that if you just throwing fastballs is, and again, if you think about it, like you guys all saw Bull Durham, hold it like an egg. And for the most part, I think as you go up into higher levels, most people are not squeezing their fastballs really tight. Now, it might change a little if you're throwing a cutter or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, you're not squeezing the fastball really hard. But guess what? You start getting into your off-speed stuff, sliders. My FDS is really engaged there. So I'm to get that spin, I'm a little tighter here. So am I fatiguing my FDS more if I'm a heavy slider guy? Maybe. And what do we know about FDS? Well, we know it's the most involved. It's the most, FCU is the most intimate with the UCL being directly under it. But if you look at EMG studies and you look at just firing pattern studies, the FDS is the most involved with throwing baseballs. So this all kind of adds up, right? And that's where I was going with this. The other one is the curveball. Same thing, right? I'm pretty engaged with my FDS. I'm squeezing relatively hard because why? Because I want to spin this thing. And guess what? So FDS, but now this is the one pitch where I'm supinating and I'm ulnar deviating, right? What's that? FCU. Those are the two. And then what's getting some press now is the new player on the block, the pronator, that we didn't really think about it before. And guess where we see the pronator? Guys are throwing their changeups, but to get the nasty action, they're getting the hyper pronation when they're throwing. Right? So that's where I was going with this. And that's why I think it was an important study, and that was the background for it. And I think it is a jumping off point for a lot of things we do. And as much, I know organizations point blank that reached out and they said, asked the same questions, and a number of those organizations measure every hand in their organization now.
They did, though. They didn't prior to this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the main question, Doc, I had on this is kind of like, so what? Right. So, but I think you answered it in that when you're thinking about a kid that has some kind of problem, you're like, well, you're at risk for this problem because your hand size may be different. So do you use this study more of not necessarily as a proactive, risk factor, but after the fact, something's happened and you're like, maybe you guys need to hang this up and think about another sport, perhaps. Is that how this study could be used in clinical world?
Yeah, I don't think it's hanging out, look for another sport, but I think as we gain more momentum going downstream and getting into performance and getting into, my first step would be this. If you're talking like college level guys, pro guys, hand size, what's the arsenal and how are we going to monitor them? And who's at higher risk? And depending on how we monitor them, are we going to have a more, like, is their flexor work going to be different than the 6'8" guy, who's stronger at baseline or whatever it might be, right? And I think that we're starting to get those answers, but we don't have them. So that would be one piece of this. I think the other piece with the youth throwers is ways of tracking, ultimately, I can talk about some conflict I have because I have a startup company that has what I think is going to be a game-changing technology, but I think it's going to get to a point where we know from literature that not just with elbows or anywhere, that a lot of times, and you guys know this, if you start to fatigue, you're going to get like almost a little bump in contraction or a bump in, you work a little harder to maintain where you are before you go back down. It's not like you're a flat line and then you fatigue, right? You're going to get that little bump trying to compensate and before you go down. And we need to look into this more in fairness, but some work that we have done here, and this is some unpublished work I did when I was in fellowship a long time ago, but we used a certain type of valgus stress machine out with the Cal Berkeley pitchers, and they went through this 3-inning simulated game, and then we would measure, baseline after their bullpen, after first inning, second inning, third inning, and just looked at, using a fish hook and pulling to their endpoint, how much force was I pulling to get to the endpoint, and how much valgus laxity were we seeing? And you start to get to a point where at that third inning, you're pulling harder to get them to their endpoint because those muscles are fighting you. So, right?
Even when they're
Trying to
relaxed.
combat
This is done
valgus
relaxed, right?
laxity.
Yeah.
So what happens if that goes on? Or if you're in a long inning? So I think that with the youth athletes, and again, a lot of work will have to go into this, but I would foresee a day where the coaches, it's not, the pitch count thing I think is good in a sense, because there's some guardrails. But, a 6'1" kid who's 13, who weighs 160 pounds, having the same pitch count as a kid who's 5'4" and weighs a $110 doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I think we got to get more granular with that. And I think that monitoring what's going on with baselines of what they have on the ball. So a little league kid warms up. This is his fastball. This is how much pressure is being imparted upon that baseball. And every inning when he goes out to throw his warm-up pitches, the coach sees on the iPad. And again, we're going to have to get more granular with these numbers. But when you start to see a change, whatever that might be, is that the natural time? So these are kind of my thoughts, Phil. But again, I'm trying to think about things in a different way, because the things that we've been traditionally doing aren't working. And once you get into college baseball and pro baseball, you're never going to tell someone you're throwing too hard.
Yeah.
Now, I think that you don't have to throw so hard every single pitch. I think that we can learn, I think that you can still be effective with, if you have 95, that you can go 92 away, 91 sinking in, now 95 up. I still think there's some of that we can improve upon, but, you're not going to tell a Formula One driver to drive slower. Right?
Michael, can you talk about are you free to speak about your device that you were alluding to? You really didn't tell everybody what your device was. You
Yeah, so
alluded to it, but can you?
I was at Michigan, and we were trying to figure this out in exactly this question. How much force is being imparted upon a baseball? There's smart baseballs out there that have IMUs in there that can tell you velo and spin rate, which you don't really need because most places have TrackMan anyway. But I guess at the youth level, it's worthwhile. But I wanted something. How much forces and where are the forces being imparted on the ball? And it had never been done. So we have, filed for the IP for that. And it started as a very 24 sensors and wires were coming out of the bottom of the ball. And it, tested it a little bit with the Eastern Michigan group. And then we, when I moved to Stanford, I stayed in touch with the guy who was an engineer at University of Michigan, brilliant guy, Olympian. He's the CEO now. And we raised the money through family and friends and found a place that specialized in sensors and software. And, it's progressed to the point now where We're across more of the sports than just baseball, but baseball is the flagship, and we have 688 sensors under the ball. And it's taken a long time to perfect this, but it's getting pretty good. We also had to find ways that it's not to be hit. It's a training
just
tool.
to throw. Yeah.
How does this ball travel 100 miles an hour and get, caught in a leather glove and not break down? So there were a lot of trials and tribulations, but it's a good product, and we have an awesome team and a lot of people that bought in, and a lot of colleges are going to be taking off with it, in the next year, working to refine it. So, I think that you start at that level and start at the pro level, and I think the biggest impact ultimately is going to be in the youth. I think that all the way going down to, a dad with his kid being able to, have this and link it to his phone, and just that way they can, it's
Monitor
kind of the repeat. Like, what do we think about when you throw a football? Like, what I think about is like, wow, that was sweet. That was a sweet spiral. That felt like I didn't have to work very hard it was perfect. Let me see if I can do it again.
how you replicate.
Same thing with the golf swing, right? Wow, that felt perfect. What did I do? And you're trying to do it again. It's the same thing with pitching. So we do it perfectly and have the perfect feel, and then we're constantly trying to keep the feel or refine the feel. Shooting a basketball, whatever sport it might be, right? This is the exact same thing, because now what do we have? Even though we have, mocap systems and whatnot, we don't have like the instantaneous feedback. We don't have the feel. Like you can look behind me and look at like, how am I throwing a curveball and put it on Edgertronic and go super slow motion, but you're still looking at that subjectively.
Yes.
You still don't know how much pressure was on my distal phalanx on my long finger when I released that. How much was on my thumb? And now if I alter these things a little bit and you're able to pick that up objectively, and you can see so we're looking at outputs. That's a game changer to me, because right now we're in a world of outputs. Velo, spin rate, horizontal movement, vertical movement. That's great. But when you got two guys standing next to each other and some guy has a nasty two-seam fastball, and then you tell player B, do what he just did. Well, where do you even start with that? But I think you can get closer if you start seeing, what's that guy's hand size? Where are his fingers placed? How is he playing with pressures? And ultimately, where I think this ball will make a difference in like high school kids, college kids, pro kids, we're in a day and age of pitch design, as you guys know. How do you create these pitches that can get people out? But some of them, we worry about might be associated with injuries. So let's throw out there, controversial pitch, a sweeper, or a controversial pitch, a split finger fastball. But those are also very effective pitches. So we're riding the red, trying to, utilize those and get guys out, but we're also potentially at risk. Well, what if you're developing a sweeper now, and you can start playing with finger pressures and ultimately look at the outputs you're getting. The outputs on this pitch are fantastic. It's better than the other one, but your input workload is less. To me, that's a victory.
No, it's great that you
answer, Phil.
Yeah.
Hopefully I touched on it.
No, it's good. It's great. Like you said, with that ball now, you can track that. You can track people to see who gets injuries, who doesn't get injuries, how they're throwing differently than people that aren't getting injuries, and tweak the different mechanics of throwing at the hand. Because you're right, when you're watching people throw, you don't really even know what's going on at the hand and wrist. And now we're going to be able to see with the use of your ball. So that's awesome. We're starting to get some questions from the audience I'll get to, but I wanted to ask you one question real quick before we started, because I don't think I saw it in the paper. I could have just missed it, but it showed that the people that had smaller hands were at increased risk. And you had mentioned something about
with the two, yeah, smaller with regards to those two
two
measurements.
measurements. Yeah. Was there was there a threshold for those that you can look for in people, or was it just if those were smaller,
Well,
they're at high
we
risk?
have the number in there. There's like an absolute number cutoff in millimeter, and that's another thing. Like if you're you know a, a sport, or if you're in something, when you think about millimeters,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times we don't worry about millimeters, but I think that when you talk about something like throwing a baseball, millimeters probably matter, right? So it's not a lot, but it's there.
There's a definite number. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was thinking, Doc, one of the things I would have liked to seen is a receiver operator curve, which would have showed us where that cutoff was in terms of the data.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you definitely have a correlation.
Hmm.
That's not a
Yes.
problem.
Yeah.
But where is that cutoff? And an ROC would be really helpul for us to
Yeah.
know where that was.
Yeah, we'll revisit that a little bit. And I redid this study. I didn't redo, well, I kind of redid the study. I wanted to see, and this is interesting, and this is in publication now, but we wanted to look at, is hand size associated with or directly correlated with velocity or
Mm.
spin rate.
Yeah.
And so we took 5 colleges around the Bay Area and we measured their hands again. And then we took their data from TrackMan data and looked,
Mhm.
curveball, slider, fastball, etc. And the thing that was really fascinating about that is, guess what? Generally speaking, there wasn't a correlation, right? It's not like you have a bigger hand, you throw harder. As a matter of fact, it kind of looked like if you had a bigger hand, the spin rate was a little bit slower on the braking stuff.
Hmm.
So, when the resident was looking at this and when we were talking about after the stats had been run, he was like, gosh, I didn't think we'd see this. I said, this is actually, to me, telling more of the story. Because what this is telling, we get so caught up in like significance, and it's like having something that's not significant in a lot of studies is just as valuable,
Yeah.
right?
You're
Sure.
preaching to the
And
For
choir
sure.
here, Doc.
so my point to him was like, look, guys with smaller hands are spinning it just as fast or even faster. Makes me think it kind of goes back. Are they truly working their flexor pronator more? Because they have to squeeze a little harder. We'll know more once we get
Yeah.
the force ball inputs. But
For sure.
but it's interesting, right?
Yeah. For
It's
sure.
just something to think about. And it's multi. It's not one of these things where I'm like it's only about the hand.
Yes.
But I
Exactly.
think it has a piece to it. I
Piece
mean,
of the
of course,
puzzle.
throwing all year round, workload, long innings, velo, core mechanics, all those things are pieces of the same pie. But I think we had a major slice not baked in, which now potentially.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That no one was even looking at. Yeah. Okay. So let's get to some of the participants that are watching tonight, some of their questions. So the first one is by Douglas. Um, how do you pronounce his name there, Phil? Verdi? Would it be Verdi? The
Birdie.
T? Verdi?
Yeah.
Verdi? The T silent? Okay. So Douglas asked, would you recommend adding hand size to the preseason pre-injury screening to a throwing training program to identify those athletes and to adjust the training program to increase flexor pronator strengthening and endurance along with minimizing other factors? You kind of spoke to a little bit of that,
Yeah,
Doc, but
I think that I think that a lot of this is going to be learning how to navigate this and learning how to do it's going to be important. But I think getting hand sizes is you should do it because if anything, you're going to be able to look at your own stuff, and as more comes out, you're going to be able to look back. So I think getting hand size is good. I think that getting hand strength, and we know it's hard to get flexor strength because we know if you use a hand dynamometer, a Jabbar, or something like that, there's a lot of factors playing into that. You're not getting purity, if you will, of each, digits flexor
Yeah.
or what. But I think force ball is going to change that a little bit. We're going to be able to get that better. You know, there's other things on the market that you can potentially get it. There's some smaller digit dynamometers that have pluses and minuses. So I think that those things are good. But having hand size, I think, is just something that's not that hard to do, and is probably going to be worth the information in the future.
Next question is from Craig Dugan. With a heavy focus on pronator and flexor strengthening, is there potential for overreaction resulting in a potential increase in stress reaction injuries versus UCL injuries in the youth pitchers?
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question right. So you're saying, worrying too much about strengthening the flexor side
Uh-huh.
or over
And it
strengthening
says,
that?
yeah, overaction resulting in a potential increase in stress injuries versus UCL injuries.
I think that's a really good question and something to think about. And again, I think that goes back to, it's easy, as all of us know, you know, say a surgical technique. It's easy sometimes to just say, "Wow, that's amazing," and you just dive 100% in instead of play with it a little bit, or some new novel thing comes out and everyone jumps right on board, and we don't ultimately know
What it's
kind of
doing, or yeah.
right. So it's a great question in the fact of how do we strengthen and maintain to optimize the flexor pronator for throwing without going overboard. Is there a way to go overboard where now we're seeing more strains? Maybe. And I think so. More work is needed to be done, no doubt. My thought at this point would be more monitoring. I think it's good for what are people coming in at baseline, what are their pitch metrics, and then being able to monitor throughout the season to start seeing if you're seeing deficits, in what, long finger FDP, long finger FDS, index finger FDPA, etc. That's kind of where we are now. That's a really good question. I don't think that nut's been cracked. So we need to get there.
Question from Matt Chappelle. Any thoughts on hand size with postoperative UCL protocols? So the question is really like, should we go a little slower if someone has a smaller hand size following UCL reconstruction versus someone with a larger hand size?
I mean, that's another
Another
fantastic
great
question. So
question.
that's why
Yeah.
it's great to have this conversation with all you guys, because you guys are thinking about the right things. But I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I think it's in the same vein, because we flexor pronator injuries are starting to be seen more now, and we're starting to see them tacked on with UCLs more often now. And there'll be a paper you'll be seeing coming out soon that shows the association of pro players with the history of the flexor pronator strain that went on to UCL. So there is an association. So I think that the answer to that is yes, but it kind of dovetails
No,
in with
yeah,
the
yeah,
previous
yeah.
question of how is that, how much, when.
You were talking about with the thought of for this study was partially due to high school athletes having smaller hands and the fatigue. Do you think the
Well,
same thing?
especially the youth. Yeah, those
Yeah,
15
yeah,
to 19-year-olds and yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Well, do you think the same thing relates to youth? So you looked at this in the professional athletes. Do you think because youth have people put up slides all the time where you've got two 15-year-olds and one of them looks like he's actually 25 and the other looks like he's 12. So their hand sizes can be really different. Do you think you would see the same thing in youth if you looked at youth and hand size and injuries? Do you think the youth with smaller hands are at higher risk than youth with larger hands?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
we have to go look at that, but I think
Yeah,
that
yeah.
this is again going to be the ground for a lot of studies. And we have some in the pipeline now. Looking at, I think that if you have my question is not necessarily going back because we're not going to have this big pool of the same, of being able to look whether they had an injury or not. Where would, but what I'm interested in is you're looking at these youth, different ages, and you see the forces being imparted upon the ball, and what's their baseline, and are the different hand sizes fatiguing faster? And if they're fatiguing faster, are they at elevated risk?
And if they're elevated risk, what can you do to fix that so that they're not fatigued or they have more endurance or can throw
Right.
longer
Yeah.
without getting
Yeah.
Yeah, or
Barb,
fatigued?
can
Yeah.
I
until they
jump in
get
real
bigger,
quick?
is that how you are, getting more granular on the pitch count stuff?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Good. Of course,
Because
Barbara, go
can I
ahead.
jump in real quick?
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
other thing I think we'd be really, really cautious here about correlation versus causation. And so we're treading a really fine line here. So that's my journal editor hat going on. And then the other thing is I think that we have to be really thoughtful about the difference between strength and endurance. So
Yeah.
so as a physical therapist, I mean I'm all about strengthening and getting the right muscles strong. But what you're talking about with inning to inning changes potentially with the ball and those things, that's more of an endurance construct, I think,
Hmm.
than it is a raw strength construct. So those are both really important things, but I would really encourage like the right research question to answer the right question, sort of a thing, because I think that that's really important in this case. I love the novelty of this and I love the idea, but it's like I'm still kind of thinking my head's going about 100 miles an hour. Like, okay, where do you go with this? Do you tell the kid with a small hand you really should wait a while to pitch? You can't do that. Or do you
No, no,
tell
no,
the
not at all. Not
right,
at all.
right.
But and I don't think, and again, I don't think it's. I think to answer your question, is it strength? Is it endurance? Which one's more important? Which one's not? So my thing with the monitoring kids throwing, if you have their baseline and what force they impart on a baseball, and they throw their innings, it does. If they're what they're imparting on it is changing. And again, we need to know more before we
Yeah,
can
yeah.
give, we don't want to go rogue on this, but I'm saying in the long play,
Hmm.
if you get to a point where you can see that changes that from their baseline on the ball,
Hmm.
that and it might be they're showing less, their endurance is poor, but they're grabbing the ball less because they're
Hmm.
fatiguing.
Hmm.
Again, is that the end point where they could get,
That's
I don't, that would be my thoughts there. I mean,
That's a good
if
thought.
you,
Yep, it's a very good thought.
but you're right. We can't go rogue on it.
For sure. Yeah. All right. Next question from Thomas Loper. Do you think the increased awareness of spin rate, you talked about spin rate and a lot of the other variables earlier, Doc. Do you think the increased awareness of spin rate uh, to monitor? No, this doesn't really make sense.
Do
Sorry.
you need me to
Do you?
read for you, Rob?
Yes. Can you? Well, it's not reading quite right. Yeah. Can you
Okay,
read
so
it?
do you think the increased awareness of spin rate and the access to monitor that spin rate at all
There you
levels
go.
has
Thank you.
increased injury rate? And do you think we should proactively be more aggressive with strengthening of the smaller handed athlete before we see an injury?
Well done. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I absolutely think, it's hard not to think that young pitchers are chasing numbers, but even at the pro. It's hard. You go to a baseball game now. I mean, I don't know how you guys are, but you look at the velos up there, the spin rates up there, all the people get are all excited. You
Hmm.
look at that into what pitch do they think it was? You look at that, and when you start going down um, to younger levels, and they're seeing those metrics, they're going to start chasing them. And unfortunately, we're kind of digging our own graves a little bit with the pitchers because now you have, scouts, colleges, travel teams looking at metrics. And the thing that's interesting is it makes sense that spin rate, would, if you spin it harder on a slider, that it should be nastier. But, a curveball, we don't really know that, right? I think that the spin rate thing still is a little bit of a interesting phenomenon. I mean, one of the slowest spin rates on a curve is Clayton Kershaw, but he has one of the best curveballs. And so I think that much like anything, we need to find the sweet spot of spin rates, and that's why I think that from a performance standpoint, getting something that's going to allow you to maximize that, if your spin rate is in this range, it gets the most mishits or whiffs, I guess you'd say. But once it goes above that, maybe it flattens out and it's not as effective, but it's, however many revolutions faster. So, so you start chasing numbers that we don't know about. You still have to get guys out, which small fact we forget about sometimes.
When it comes down to it, that's the meat right there. You got to get them
But
out.
yeah,
There's just so much. There's so much
that was a
data
lot
now.
with that second paper that you have, Rob. The reason that we were going to talk about that second paper is exactly that. We have all these metrics that are being
Metrics, yeah.
constantly, looked at,
And we don't even know what they mean yet, really. I mean, we know what they mean, but we
we're
don't know
correlating
the.
them with history
Yeah,
with injuries,
yeah.
but I think it's a dangerous thing, and you want to be able to throw hard, but as you're younger, I still think that it's probably old school thinking, but I still think that, if you can throw a fastball, if you're 11 years old, if you can throw a fastball to each third of the plate, outside, middle, inside, and you can do that, and you grow, and you can routinely do that, and then you start mixing in a changeup, and you can put that in all three spots,
You're gonna be pretty
that's
good.
pretty successful.
Successful.
And then you
I
start mixing in the other stuff.
I have a
It's
question
old school thinking, but it's like it's the net. I mean, I think that we're in a day and age we want to get, be the, throwing 100 miles an hour before we even know how to pitch, and that a lot of
What
that's
you're,
mechanics, and
I
a lot of that's just doing it the old-fashioned way. And I
going
don't know.
back to the basics. It's back to the basics of pitching. We talk about going to the basics with rehab stuff all the time.
But
Going back to
and you guys see, like I have some great PTs in the Bay Area here that see a lot of the throwers, and any thrower that's 17 or younger, regardless if they're coming in with a suspected UCL or a suspected slap tear, is usually what's getting sent in. 90% of them positive step down, positive scapular dyskinesia, positive
hmm
coracoid tenderness, weak rotator cuff. It's like you can write it down.
Yeah, it's already there. Yeah,
Very, for you get 8 of those for everyone that you see. Like I threw one pitch and I felt my elbow explode and the UCL's gone.
That kind of feeds in. I've been
exactly.
trying to think of how to word this question, but have you looked at anything, particularly with the grip strength in the ball, correlating or trying to correlate like kinematic sequence of the throwing motion with how much they're gripping the ball, right? So like
Yeah,
if
that's
you're just
all coming.
functional,
That's all
okay,
coming. Yeah,
okay,
because that would be like, you have like basically, you take a picture with like, let's say an iPhone of somebody all the way through their, you know, all 6 phases of throwing. Well, now you have the ball and you can get the same. It's tracking it all the way
right,
through.
yeah.
Because that's a great
Yeah.
question. Awesome question. Because I think to myself, I actually have a study I need to get done, and I have a lot of people mad at me because we haven't got this done yet. But I think to myself, and it'd be interesting to get your guys' thoughts. At the youth levels, a lot of times they'll teach this, Tommy John twist we call it, but this turn, show the ball to center field, show the
Right.
ball to center field.
Yeah.
And I always thought to myself, what? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Because if you are pronating like that, you're already putting more tension on the medial side of the elbow, and then you're coming through in the fastest motion we know. So I always wonder about that. So to answer your question, I think that's what's going to be so interesting about looking at like where, what's the forces on this ball? Where are the forces? And with certain types of mechanics,
Yeah.
What happens if they have the, kind of the swinging gait? They let their hips open early, and now we
Yeah.
start. Are we going to see different forces with the way
That's what
they're
I was.
holding it versus? Yeah, so I think that's an awesome
Well,
like
because
question.
so my world is hip, and so we see all these correlations between people who are having hip surgeries and have already had their UCL, or then eventually have their UCL, and it's like
Yeah,
there's definitely a connection, right? So
I
if you
bet there's
can't
a
load
huge
into your
connection.
hip,
Yeah.
you can't
absolutely.
create ground force reaction. How are you going to create force? I'm going to throw this thing as hard as I can with my arm.
Right.
Um, and so it's that I'm very interested in what you come up with.
Yeah.
No, I
I
think
bet you'll
that's
see what he said. If you got weak hips and trunk, weak
Yeah.
shoulder, weak scapula, they're going to be gripping the ball more, I would think, and you're have more force at the ball with the hand, wrist, and elbow. Yeah, seems reasonable. But
So many
yeah, we'll
questions.
find
We
out.
have so many
We'll find out.
questions. This is
Yeah.
good. It's
Um,
stirring things
with,
up.
I think this
here's
person
another.
must. Oh, sorry. I was going to
Did
say
you have
this one
one?
must know him. Robert Carlson. Do you know Robert Carlson? Said, Dr. F, do you recall Steve Carlton and one of his workouts doing hand fingers into rice and working intrinsics and long flexors pronators? He was a unique character, is what he said.
No, well, and so interesting. And I don't know if you guys do this, but I tell families that all the time because that is something that they can do for relatively cheap
Yeah,
get
right. Okay.
a bucket and get the rice, and you can go through that
Hmm.
an exact program that is amazing. And
Yep.
so that's what's
It
really,
fatigues it.
you take
Yeah.
Steve Carlton, here's like one of the best lefties that ever lived, right? A Hall of Fame guy, and he's doing that. So it's like sometimes you go back and
Well,
they
that
they
was
were
that was the
doing what we
80s.
were talking about, but
That was the 80s, Doc. That was rice buckets were the thing back in the
Yeah.
80s.
yeah.
Yeah.
And down in Louisiana where we are, we grow a lot of rice. So at LSU, that's what we had. We had rice buckets everywhere. And it's funny how trends do this,
Yeah,
right? So rice buckets need to come back. It's about time.
I agree with you.
Maybe tonight. Tonight's the night, Phil. We're bringing them back.
We're bringing buckets back.
You-
Oh, sorry.
Rice buckets,
Rice buckets, Barb. Rice buckets.
$5 at the Home Depot.
Yeah, that's
All
it.
right, Doc. I think this is a good question by Nate Herner. Would the length of the forearm segment, because you talked about wrist flexor musculature, would the length of the forearm segment and by extension length of the wrist flexor musculature have an association with injury risk? Or is it yeah,
I think so.
yeah.
I think so, but that's where I think all these questions are really
Great questions, but we don't
good,
know the
really
answer.
good questions
Yeah.
because yeah, I think it's really good questions. I actually think, I mean, you guys have probably reviewed something that you look in the tennis literature and you look at those, how big that forearm is on their dominant arm versus the other one, and you see pictures of the guy sometimes, and it's like
It's huge. Yeah.
way asymmetric. So I think there's something to that, and that might get into the bigger question of as muscles get longer or get bigger, does that allow them to be able to throw pitches? If you threw a split finger fastball, we know how much, like just splitting it like that, how much I can feel, kind of the bowing up my flexor pronator. If that's longer, does that tolerate that better? Is it truly just a finger deal? Um, we look at the split a little bit. We looked at it with all of our A's guys, and I was, asked the minor league guys when I was there doing their physicals, anyone who threw a split, and there were like 11 of them, and I took a picture, and guess what? Like there were all, they're old school split, but there were about 9 different split grips. Some of them don't split very wide. Some of them hand are small. Some of them are doing this Vulcan stuff. Some of them, I mean, it's wild. So, I think that there's so much, there's a lot of questions, but it's an avenue that hasn't been totally explored. And I think that avenue is worthwhile just because we haven't seen the decrease in the injury rates with the throwers that we would like to see.
Another good question. I'm guessing you probably haven't looked at this, but from Michael Way.
I know, Michael.
Oh, you know, Michael? Okay. Does the ratio of hand size to body size play a role in any of these findings? And does anybody, I mean, does anybody know? Has people looked at the
We don't know
ratio of
yet, but I think that
hand
that's, I
size
mean,
to
you
body
look at like
size?
the NFL quarter, Russell Wilson's not a tall guy. You ever see his hands are big.
Yeah.
You see some of these, smaller guys, their hands aren't quite as big and they get into some trouble. So I think that's a really good question as well. And
Yeah.
I noticed I noticed that sometimes really big guys and they have kind of small hands, and then you have the smaller picture and you're like, whoa, that's a pretty
Big
good
hand.
sized hand.
Yeah.
So does that make a difference? There is going to be a percentage
A
that
lot of
we need
great
to look at.
questions here. Yeah. I think you answered this one. They didn't leave their name there. The Phil's favorite, the anonymous attendee. They ask, is there normative values available to determine the cutoff for injury risk, which I think is what you alluded to earlier already, Doc. So that one was answered. So I guess we have like 2 minutes left, Doc. So I apologize, we didn't get to the second paper.
Well, we touched on it though, because the
Yeah,
main point of that was just with the metrics and how they're becoming part of the exciting. They're becoming a very prominent part of the literature with so many people reporting on them and trying to make correlations. So that was the point, and that got into the question of, are they potentially ushering in some potential issues, with chasing,
metrics. Yeah.
those metrics.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that we usually do if we only get through one, that gives us a great segue to ask you back in the future to go over your second paper, if you wouldn't mind. So, yeah. So, Doc, do you have anything? What if it just kind of wrapping up? Tell us kind of give us the quick elevator speech on what the importance of this paper again, and the big thing you want everybody to know about it to take home and hopefully try to use with baseball players they're seeing.
Yeah. Well, I think, especially with this audience, the big thing is, again, I think there's something to the hand and, how much the hand has to work. And depending on that, how fast your flexor pronator fatigues. And being the primary dynamic stabilizer, if that fatigues, when it fatigues or fatigues over a season, is the UCL seeing more stresses? So I think like what I would say to you is just, start think about that when you see these different patients, athletes, and start looking into that a little bit. And I mean, we can all learn from each other. So I think we're kind of early in the evolution of this line of thinking. But my thought would be, again, to go back to the comment about, do I think somebody has a small hand they can't play? Absolutely not. I don't think that at all. But what we do need to think about is, do we need to spend more time with that individual with recovery? Maybe it's a rice bucket type of recovery. And recovery is different than strengthening, as you guys know. So those types of thought processes. Do we need to do more modalities on somebody who's a little bit shorter with a smaller hand, who's a heavy slider guy, a little more manual stuff? Who knows? But that's kind of where my thoughts are right now, and just kind of trying to learn more about that and introduce some technology to help in that, however
That area. Yeah. No, think of at least like you said, where in the past we haven't really thought about the hand. Start at least thinking about it. Keep it in your mind as you're seeing these patients, and let's look into it more. Great. It's great talking with you tonight about this, Doc. This is fascinating stuff. It's new, like I said, really kind of novel, innovative, and we're all looking forward to see what stuff you produce with it, and looking forward to see what we find out about the hand and its relation to UCL injuries and baseball injuries in general.
All right. Well,
Thank you very much.
Thanks.